Hey, greetings everyone, and welcome to session 3 of our new discussion series here in Jefferson County, Missouri called New Answers for a New Day, learning and listening to today's voices on racism in our culture and in Jefferson County. These discussions are being sponsored by the Twin City Area Ministerial Alliance, also known as the TCAMA. I'm Pastor Randy Starkey, and I am the host today for the TCAMA. And we are privileged today to have 3 great individuals with us. So our panelists today are Jefferson County Sheriff Dave Marshak, a 29-year law enforcement veteran who started in North St. Louis County and has now been with Jefferson County Sheriff's Office for the last 26 years. And Dave has commanded most all of the divisions within the Sheriff's Office prior to being elected sheriff. He holds an undergraduate degree from Lindenwood University and a master's degree from St. Louis University. He is also an adjunct professor at Jefferson College, and he teaches law enforcement classes to local, state, and federal officers alike. Dave is a recipient of countless awards and citations. And joining him as our other panelist is Mr. Alvin Riney, who was born and raised here in Jefferson County in Crystal City and graduated from St. Pius High School. He is a retired teacher and also a 13-year law enforcement veteran, including serving here in Jefferson County. He is currently co-chair of Giving Back Something to the Community and is also on the Cultural Diversity Committee here locally. And then joining us today as our MC is Mr. Jim Sparling, who is also a lifelong resident of our county in Herculaneum and a St. Pius and Jefferson College graduate. He's excelled in business for many years and is married to his high school sweetheart and just recently celebrated 50 years of marriage. So congratulations, Jim. He is the longest living member of the Cultural Diversity Committee that sponsors the Cultural Diversity Black History Luncheon each year in February. And this past year, they hit 25 years of sponsoring that event. So that was great. So we welcome to each of you today to our discussion series. And our topic for this 3rd session of what will be 4 sessions produced in this series is policing in Jefferson County. We've had 2 great discussions so far. The first one with 2 young adults that shared their stories of growing up Black in Jefferson County, and the second one as a current racial perspective in our county. And today, I believe our 3rd discussion on the topic of policing and racial issues will be very helpful from our panelists who have great experience, as of course it relates directly to the death of Mr. George Floyd. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Jim. And Jim, you can get our discussion rolling here today.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again today. I'll start off by talking to Sheriff Marshak and asking him a question about, I know we've experienced 3 protest rallies in Jefferson County since the death of George Floyd. I believe there's one in Festus, Arnold, and Fenton. Was there any violence or out of hand conduct or arrests that the Sheriff's Department had to deal with during those protests, Sheriff?
So all the protests that we had in Jefferson County were relatively quiet. They were all peaceful. I think they were well organized, well attended. And I think in the situation for the protest that was organized in both Arnold and Festus, the local police departments worked with the protest organizers to make sure everything was set up and organized. And I think everything went very smooth in both of those protests. They were by all means considered peaceful. And you know, I will tell you in terms of constitutional protections for people who are protesting government, who are protesting police, there's that constitutional protection that we want to afford everybody, you know, and we have to be cognizant of that. We had no issues that I'm aware of in either Arnold or Festus. We did have one slight issue up in the Fenton area. We had a couple of protests that were targeting a business that manufactures chemical munitions for law enforcement, specifically the pepper spray and some of the pepper balls that you hear about. some of those specialty munitions. They had received numerous threats. And so we had officers deployed up there. We had some protests going on in there. And the only issue that we had was a situation in which a protester and a counter protester had actually verbally got into it back and forth, where they were going to meet in the middle of the street to have a physical confrontation. The deputy intervened, and unfortunately one of the deputies was assaulted and somebody was arrested. So relatively peaceful in Jefferson County. There was only one arrest, and so no other major issues in our county.
Good. That's good to hear. Alvin, I don't know, were you able to go to any of those rallies?
No, I wasn't able to attend any of them. Had a lot of family that attended the protest there in Festus.
Right.
And like I said, it's relatively peaceful, but the one thing that I just didn't like, and I know a lot of people that were there, protesters, was the fact that you minimize their protest, I think law enforcement did, by not allowing them to march. Because the only thing that they were able to do was to walk around in circles on a parking lot. I mean, that is minimizing their protest. That is putting some kind of muzzle on their voice, because letting them walk, if you know the community, you know that the people are, you should know that they're not there to cause problems.
Problems, right.
And the only thing, when the service and protection in law enforcement, that is your main job. That is what they do. But the only thing it seemed like they were trying to protect, to me, was just the businesses. Because I know firsthand that some businesses called some of the organizers and talked to them and were worried about their businesses being destroyed or burned or whatever, looted. And the thing is, know your people, know your citizens. And if you know them, I think you're going to have more confidence in them and allow them to do what they need to do and still protect them.
Yeah, so I just have a comment on that, because I was not part of operationally the planning in terms of the events. I will tell you from our position, because both of those situations occurred in a municipality, it was up to the municipal police chiefs and the municipal organizers to kind of coordinate some of those things. So specifically in terms of the rules per se, I don't know what was worked out. So I'm very reluctant to say that that's acceptable or unacceptable. I will tell you that I was familiar with some business owners that were concerned about a protest in the area. Legally, I have a hard time believing that the police restricted movement and kept things isolated to one piece of property, because
They did.
So constitutionally, you're protected to walk around, right? I mean, let's put that out there. But I don't know and you said, sir, you weren't there. I wasn't there, so I don't know about that communication. But I will tell you that we have, at least at the sheriff's office, no position to restrict that movement and to participate in a march. And that's not something that we would restrict movement on. I can just tell you for our own personal policy, again, that's not the municipal policies. Our position was there to support the municipalities should there be any incidents. And we had a contingency of additional officers out there to support the public and peaceful protests, and at the same time protect business and property owners as well. So we did not have to take an active role.
Well, and to Alvin's point, I know that I've got several calls up until the day of the march, and from business owners who were concerned, whether it be propaganda was out on the internet or whatever, but they were concerned and thought that our culture diversity committee was sponsoring the march, which we weren't. And I think maybe there's a lesson to be learned there from the people who actually were organizing this to get the people involved, like the sheriff's department. And I know the city and the mayors were all involved in it. They had a meeting at Festus Library the night before, and it asked me to attend. Unfortunately, I was out of town, but I think the march would have certainly been more effective had they been able to go to Alvin's Point from City Hall to City Hall, but it was restricted for whatever reason, and it is what it is.
And I don't, like I said, I don't know. I wasn't, in terms of operational planning, our organization was not, playing a critical role in that. And for us, it's the balance of we want the community to know we're there. We had several people that I found out later, spoke with our officers and we're talking about it, and that community engagement's important. But for us, it's finding the balance of how much personnel do we have visible, to where we don't want to intimidate, with a large, police presence where people feel like, we're restricting them or that we're not in support of them. Listen, I think we have a fundamental right to protest our government and the police, without a doubt. So for us, it was that balance of how many cars do we have there in case there is some disruption or we have instigators or something. And at the same time, we want, the public to feel comfortable that there's enough resources there if something happened, that their property would be secure. So it was, for us, it's a tough balance sometimes.
Sure. Sheriff, I'd like to ask you about, well, first of all, just make a statement that I read where Governor Parsons back in June appointed you to the Police Officer Standard and Training Commission, known as POST, which establishes police training standards and advises the state on Department of Public Safety on law enforcement issues. He also appointed at the same time Gary Hill, an African-American. He is Lincoln University's Chief of Police and Director of Public Safety. Was this in response to the recent incidents surrounding the police force and chokeholds in other parts of the country? Or was that?
Well, I have not personally spoke with the governor about, why the timing. I mean, I think there were some articles in the paper suggesting that the Post Commission didn't even have a quorum, and we're approaching a time in which, we need to really examine law enforcement training. And I think we all agree on that, whether that be from the chokeholds or duties to intervene. So, while in terms of the timing of it, I don't know if everything that's going on stimulated the need for it, but I will tell you that from conversations I've had where I attended the first board meeting and the governor was there, I think he's really interested in the Post Commission making some valuable recommendations in terms of how things are going to go for the future for law enforcement. The Post Commission is outlining both standards for academy students and then in-service training program hours for current police officers. And I think through the course of our discussions, we've identified a number of different things that the Post Commission can act upon to increase public trust. Some of it is financially prohibitive. The state of Missouri is facing a financial shortfall, so we need to figure out a financial stream in terms of how that would work. But I believe the Post Commission, looking forward to the future, will be more robust. I have several recommendations that I think can improve our profession by holding some police officers accountable. It needs to be worked in through legislation, but also that funding component. So in the role of a post commissioner, I've been very vocal in the first meeting and follow-up stuff. I'm very engaged with the area police chiefs, both in Jefferson County and the St. Louis area, and the Missouri Sheriff's Association, to have these conversations on how to improve policing in terms of training and standards.
Good. Well, that brings me to my next question. I read somewhere where your department is responsible for training the other law enforcement agencies serving in our county. Is that true?
No, well, no, that was a kind of a misquote.
Okay.
So the reality is we're responsible really for our own training. We do more training than anybody else. And so, but we also have a more robust training than any other agency in the county. And so frequently we will bring training components from outside, outsourced guest speakers, instructors, and that sort of thing. They're very expensive. Sometimes they can run up to $7,000 for an 8-hour class when you figure in expenses and travel, that sort of thing. And so when we're bringing these world-class speakers in, we want to offer that for every agency in the county. And so we do. And so other agencies in Jefferson County benefit as a result of our training program. And it's just one of the things that we can do to help support police officers throughout the entire Jefferson County. Quite honestly, some of the municipalities in Jefferson County struggle financially for the resources and training moving forward. I mean, they really do, because they struggle sometimes of having manpower on the street and then taking time off to go to some of these courses. So it's a challenge, but we are not directly responsible for their training. That is
Okay.
individual police leadership. That is a city. It's a city issue in terms of how much they will allocate for funding resources, in terms of how much time they will. So I would not accept that burden.
Okay, good. All right. Well, what is your department doing to address diversity, equity, and inclusion with African American input and policy matters regarding training, hiring techniques, and other related personnel issues affecting our county?
Well, so you asked a lot. Let's break it down little by little. I will tell you that law enforcement agencies for decades have actively attempted to recruit more minorities. It is a problem in our profession, and there's a lot of comments out there that, in criticism sometimes, that law enforcement doesn't have a proportional mix of minorities or different representatives of their staff in terms of policing. But it's incredibly difficult because, for a number of different reasons. But if you talk specifically about Jefferson County, we've attempted to recruit through magazines that will go to minorities. But I will tell you, Jefferson County has a horrible ratio of hiring minorities, but they're not applying. And that comes down to a couple of different things. One is that Jefferson County is in the Sheriff's Department. We do not have our own police academy. So we must choose candidates from other police academies, whether that's in St. Louis City, St. Louis County, St. Charles County. We have an academy through the college. So we're competing for the same pool. The reality of Jefferson County is it is not a diverse county, and we know this, right? I mean, we're talking about a very small minority population. Since I've been sheriff, we have not had one African American apply with our organization. So that's a challenge. The minorities that are coming into our profession are choosing departments that are paid higher, that have better compensation packages in St. Louis County. Maryland Heights is going to get first pick, some of your St. Charles departments, because of the compensation package. And that's what it comes down to sometimes.
Sure.
And so if you're living in, St. Louis County and you have a choice of these departments where, the challenges in Jefferson County are much different. It is a rural place. We're very busy. We've always talked about the challenges of not having manpower and resources to assist other officers. Your backup's further away. There's a lot of reasons why people don't choose Jefferson County. But specifically, if you are a minority interested in policing, the opportunities are abundant. If you have a college education, you can go federal, and the compensation packages there are going to trump anything locally that is offered. And so the challenge continue. It's not that police do not want more minorities. They're actively recruiting all the time, but we're not getting the pool of candidates to even apply with us. So it's a challenge. It continues to be a challenge for us.
Well, to that point, Alvin, in your 13 years in law enforcement, what has changed the most, and do you miss your time you spent enforcing the law?
Well, I enjoyed what I did. I worked the streets, and then I worked undercover for the state. But then the things that have changed, I've been away from it so long that, I couldn't compare A to B, because
Yes.
I know it has changed a lot. And to tell you the truth, I wouldn't want to be in Sheriff Marshak's shoes these days, okay? Because it's a different animal out there, okay? It's almost a total lack of respect for law enforcement. And I know there's been a problem in Jefferson County ever since I was a little kid, as far as respecting the law enforcement. And I can remember an incident when I was probably 9 or 10 years old, and I was in Ward 1, Crystal City, and there was an incident where people were getting into it about whatever. I don't remember what it was, but the city rolled up and everything continued to get there. The county rolled up and everything continued to grow and escalate. And then all of a sudden, one trooper pulls up in his nice shiny car, steps out, puts on that hat, and everybody stops. They had respect for those troopers, okay? But they didn't have respect for the county and the locals, which one, the troopers don't interact with them as much. And then two, it's the way that they have had interactions with their law enforcement that has deemed whether or not they trust them and they respect them. And that's one thing I was going to ask Sheriff Marshak was, you know, he talked about the training and everything that you guys go through. And with that training, how do you approach the fact that, yes, I can go to this training, sit there and get this certificate, but then it doesn't change my attitude? How do you address that? Because, you know, you go into situations and you're in an area and you have certain attitudes about certain people in that area, in certain areas, and then stereotypes and things like that. So how do you address that based upon, you know, the training that they're given?
So that's a balance for us as well. I think what you're speaking of in some sense is a culture. What's our culture? You know, what's our culture here? What do we allow? What do we tolerate? I think in Jefferson County, we've been more bold at some of the training. You know, we've done interfaith training. As a matter of fact, a segment of our population, our citizens, criticized us because we exposed our officers to the Muslim faith. And, a segment of the population was like, oh, everybody's terrorists. And we're like, no, listen, we have a responsibility to police everybody in the community and treat everybody with dignity and respect regardless. And so we've done different training and offered different training classes. Now, I can't, sit right next to one-on-one officer and say, pay attention, no rude comments. Listen, there are officers in any profession, but there are police officers that are biased for whatever reason. The guy's got a red shirt and I hate red shirts. I mean, we all come to the table with biases. And the challenge for us is making the training both quality in terms of perspective, getting the feedback necessary. But I think we continue to attack it because it's not going to be, you and I know you can't go to one class and then, this epiphany light goes on and everything's changed. I think it has to be continuous. I think it has to be repetitive. I think we have to hit it from different directions. And so I think moving forward, and as we're at now, that the diversity in the training and getting different perspectives is important. So I can't make them pay attention to every single thing. We've done some different things. Are you familiar with the PBS special Black and Blue, where they interviewed the officers from St. Louis City and St. Louis County?
No, I'm not.
So it was a 3-part series on PBS, again, interviewing minority officers and talking about their experiences growing up, why they chose to go into the police profession and some of the challenges they had, both in their community perspective and working in their law enforcement agencies. We made it mandatory for our officers to watch that, and they had to sit through the whole thing, our document management system, make sure they do that, and then we test them on it. So, we're not there in terms of, one-on-one conversation with, because we have almost 180 deputies, but we can test them to make sure they got the information that we wanted them to get out of the training component. So we continue to do those type of things. I think moving forward, we have to have the discussions. We have to continue to have the diversity in training, and hopefully those things continue to influence. But most importantly, I think it really comes down to our culture. What do we accept as leaders? When there is a violation or when there are biases, it's our responsibility to address it. And I think that's a culture issue. It's a culture issue with other departments. that don't address it and allow it, and it perpetuates and it festers and it gets worse and worse. So I think as a culture, we do a great job at addressing that with our people.
Yeah, and that's good to hear. I'm sorry, Jim, I'm not, but
No, that's
like,
okay. That's fine.
when I was there at Crystal City, we went to a diversity training up in St. Louis County, and I enjoyed the actual diversity training. It was something I thought that we really needed. But I get back to Crystal City and I overhear several different officers talking about, man, that was a waste of time. So that is what you're talking about. That culture is, you know, it's there and it's allowed to stay there and fester. And so it's going to take a long time probably to get that out of there, because it's not only talking about race relations between the police officers, but in that same aspect, it was talking about the socioeconomic differences. You know, there's some places there with low income that the way some of the officers talk to them was just outrageous. And then they go into the predominantly Black areas and they feel like they have to come in there heavy handed instead of having a conversation with somebody and diffusing situations. So that's where I come from.
And I will tell you, I'm very cautious. I have friends at different departments, and I'm cautious about commenting on different organizations. But I will tell you, from our perspective, it is a leadership component and a culture component. That number one, we have a requirement to treat people with dignity and respect, and I think that goes across the board, regardless of what your position is in this county. And I think we do a good job. I would be ignorant if I said I know what happens on every call throughout the day with all these deputies and how they interact, right? But I do get feedback. And one of the things that's kind of unique about us and our accreditation is that our Office of Professional Standards randomly picks out different calls for service and identifies victims or people that called the police. And then we follow up with, how were you treated? We treated with dignity and respect. Did the officer answer your questions? Did the officer follow up? Is there, and it ends with, would you like somebody from our staff to call you, reference this? And so the randomness is important, the follow up. But I'm really, excited about, seeing some of the comments that come back. There will be negative comments that come back from time to time, and we address it and we get it figured out. That checks and balance is important for a police agency. I think it separates them from being a professional organization to one that just doesn't care. And so I think it's a critical component for our success. But I agree, like I said the first time, it has to be ongoing. When comments are made, they have to be addressed. If they're not addressed, they will continue to get worse. From the police perspective, in terms of some of that training, law enforcement already struggles for quality training, and officers definitely feel that so much of the touchy-feely training sometimes can water down the realities of some of their other responsibilities. And I think from a training component, it is difficult sometimes to put it all together. You almost need two police departments, one that's in training all the time to get the training that we want them to have, and the other part, answering the calls on the street and being out there. I think that's a part of it.
Well, and I know, Alvin, your time in law enforcement, I know that laid a foundation for you in your teaching and coaching career. In fact, I read online where one of your students recently wrote about you and said, I consider Mr. Alvin Riney my role model because of his dedication for what he loves to do. He continues to coach out of retirement and models a sense of poise and class throughout difficult, heated situations. These qualities make me want to aspire to be like him. I think obviously that background that you had and your training and your upbringing and leads to that kind of student making that kind of statement about you.
Well, I appreciate that comment from that student, that's for sure. Yeah, like I said, the training that I did get, like I said, I was one of those, fortunately, to really take it to heart and wanted to try to be an all-around good officer. And it's unfortunate that a lot of times today, and we hear too much about those that aren't taking that to heart. And it's, to me, you got to realize that that's your job. It is a job, but you are a human being. And now, as being a human being, how do I want to be treated? So I'm going to have to treat others the same way I want to be treated. And it's my job. It's a difficult job that I had as being a police officer, but still I have to first look and see that I'm a human being, and I got to show respect to get respect.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, moving on, Sheriff Marshak, I recently read where your department purchased $100,000 in protective gear to respond to riot situations. The Jefferson County Council voted unanimously on June 8th to allow your department to spend $530,000 from its reserves on a variety of equipment, which included the $100,000 in riot gear. Was that perhaps in response to George Floyd's killing on May 25th by Officer Chauvin?
Well, let me address a couple. Let me address a couple things here. One, it was actually not from reserves; it was unanticipated revenue that came in. So many of those things were already kind of line items, ready to be purchased. So we knew that we were going to purchase additional gun racks for the patrol cars. We knew we were going to purchase additional computers for the patrol cars. So a number of those things were already planned. And if you're referring to the leader story, there was a couple of misquotes in there, which is, very minimal, no big deal. But the reality was, in terms of response for personal protection equipment, and I know it was titled, the Sheriff's Department purchased $100,000, for riot gear. Really what we're talking about is personal protection equipment for our police officers that may encounter violence. And I will take you back to post-Ferguson, when I really did a tabletop exercise with a number of police leaders throughout Jefferson County. And we did a mock scenario in a situation. A police officer used a taser against an individual who was a minority. It ended up in a death. And as we created this scenario, one of the things that we did was we created this environment in which a police officer made a horrible statement. And it really inflamed everybody, and it kind of stoked this problem in the community to where it erupted, and we had some civil disobedience. And in creating this tabletop exercise in this hypothetical situation, we started asking police commanders throughout Jefferson County, what are your capabilities at this point? Do you have the equipment you need if you start getting these, rocks and bottles thrown at you? What kind of resources do you have? What's your manpower look like? What does this look like? Even a small scale disruption. And to draw it to a conclusion, what we realized from information that was shared was that all the law enforcement agencies in Jefferson County were ill prepared for even small scale disobedience. And so we kind of brought that to light and said, this should be something that we work towards for the future. But as financial impacts, kind of make their way to the police department, departments really struggle for equipment purchases. And so I will tell you, last year we budgeted $40,000 for this year for personal protection equipment, because we knew at some point Jefferson County is going to deal with this. The county continues to grow, and hopefully there's more diversity in Jefferson County, but there's always the potential for civil unrest, for regardless of the circumstance. And I think we have a responsibility to both protect our police officers and give them the equipment they need to do their job, and at the same time provide for the safety and welfare of the community. We spent around $100,000 to make sure our officers had things like helmets, face shields to prevent people from spitting in their face, and some larger shields to protect them from objects thrown.
Well, good. I'm glad you cleared that up.
And I hope it doesn't get used. I mean, that's the ideal situation is that we buy this equipment and it's sitting in the warehouse, and we get a check on it every so often to make sure it's ready to go. But hopefully it never comes to that. And in my 26 years here, we've only had very, very small disruptions, but it's becoming an increasingly concern. And I don't know that things are over. I think in the future we're going to have more civil unrest. There's a lot of anxiety out there in the community. COVID has certainly kind of impacted that. It makes things community a little bit more vulnerable with some of the financial stress. And so I think there's some concerns out there, but I believe we have a responsibility to protect our police officers and the community. I think it's money well spent, and hopefully it's for nothing.
Good, thank you.
Well, now the thing that when talked to several people that saw that headline in the paper, and I know that's the paper's prerogative to put the headline out there on the front page, and it says buys riot gear. That sets off alarm bells to some people, and to me, like I said, the connotation was the fact that, okay, there's going to be problems here, and we've got to make ourselves prepared for it. And it sounded like immediate problems, just by basing up on the article itself and some of the wording of the articles. As you know, just the way you word things can set off alarm bells for people. So to me, it's like you're saying, once again, it's that trust issue with the citizens here. Most citizens in Jefferson County, for the most part, they're probably good, honest, peaceful individuals. And yes, there are factions. Of course, there's factions everywhere you go, where you're going to have some that want to be disruptive and counterproductive. But it sounded to me like it's a mistrust of the citizenry. And then all of a sudden you say, well, it's not necessarily maybe the citizens of Jefferson County, but groups coming outside of Jefferson County to Jefferson County to make their point made. And or is it a subliminal message just to kind of say that there is a real problem in Jefferson County, and we have to be ready for those groups that are right here in the county that are going to cause problems because they don't want to see any kind of change. So, I mean, those are the things going through my mind when I saw that.
So I understand, I understand. We are at the mercy of whoever writes a story.
Right.
We try to get information out and have a good relationship with multiple sources, but we're at the mercy of whoever writes our story. We would rather write our own stories. Who wouldn't?
Or at least edit them.
But we're at the mercy of those asking questions and the pieces they share and how they share it. Again, I shared with somebody else on an online forum, just the term riot control gear, stimulates this thought of how things are going to be horrible. And we haven't seen that. Again, all the protests in Jefferson County thus far have been relatively peaceful. We've only had one arrest. And again, it's our responsibility to protect the constitutional rights of people to protest. I think one of the pictures that I saw from the Festus was, targeted sheriff. We don't, need chemical munitions or specialty munitions on our people. And we've never deployed that in any of the protests in Jefferson County. No, not one of our citizens has been, hit with specialty munitions or pepper spray or whatever as a result of these protests. And so, again, there's probably some bad information out there, and that's could be attributed to people writing the stories. So that's why we're always engaging. That's why we're here. That's why I'm here talking with you guys. Ask away, ask the tough questions. I'm here to answer on behalf of our department and to kind of clear up anything I can. I mean, I'm here to understand and participate and again, share information with our department on some of the challenges that we have and some of the community distrust. I think it's important that they hear it from me as well.
Right. Exactly. We appreciate that. Has your department considered a civilian review board with African-American participation to perhaps do an independent assessment of claims of excessive force by Jeffco police against the citizens? If those types of claims are brought forward, I would cite the example of lateral vascular neck, known as LVN, or excessive force during an apprehension or arrest meant to subdue or restrain the person. Do you see that as an opportunity? Or
so, well, a couple different things. One, to answer your first question, we have a sheriff's merit board, which brings recommendations for some things. It is not an independent review of police use of force. That police use of force is evaluated by supervisors from the rank for the first line supervisor from corporal all the way up to me. Ultimately, I sign off on use of forces. As a result of that internal review, sometimes we'll make decisions where they need to be investigated further. We go back, review video, or maybe send an investigator to follow up to get additional evidence from the use of force. Maybe there's additional interviews that need to be done. Sometimes the use of forces appear to be very clear cut and based on, our knowledge of both the laws and practices. They're accepted, they're within reason. And then there are those extreme cases where we send it to the prosecuting attorney's office and we, recommend a review for legal findings. Is this a violation? And the reality is, by the time that happens, we know whether it's a violation or not, but it's up to them and whether they choose to prosecute or not. So I will tell you, in Jefferson County, I'm going to pull up some stats here. In Jefferson County, last year we had 40 uses of force. And of those 40 use of force, 5 of them were stop sticks, where officers deployed stop sticks on the street. And so we qualify that as a use of force situation. Given the fact that we had more than 67,000 calls for service, to only have 35 other use of forces, considering the type of calls we're handling, that's extremely low. We have more than 700 suicidal subject calls a year. Some of those are self-mutilating themselves. I mean, we've had people torched their body parts, mutilated their body parts with a torch, a knife, or whatever. And so to only have a small fraction of use of force, some people would say, well, that's too many. But given the type of calls that these officers are doing, every day I hear the radio where somebody is suicidal or they want to kill the first police officer that shows up. And our officers do an incredible job of de-escalating and handling these situations without force. So those numbers are very low, but they do get scrutinized, and they should. We do evaluations on them every quarter.
Good, excellent.
And we do not. So, and I want to address something else. Is that as far as the board or independent review, we do not have an independent review board on the use of force. It's not that I'm opposed to it. I would want that independent review board. And I recently had a conversation with the state rep, matter of fact, last night, talking about independent reviews of police shootings. But you also need to understand, one, they need to understand case law that's been enshrined over a number of different years on police use of force. And they need to understand also how fast these things happen. And there's a lot of bad information out there. And so if we were to have an independent review police board, I would make sure that they were properly trained. Otherwise, it's going to be a train wreck.
Okay. Very good.
Hey,
My
Jim,
last question.
Let me give you
Yes.
a flag here, maybe one more, okay? And
Yeah, that's all I've got is one more question.
We'll wrap it.
And back to Sheriff Marshak again. Are you familiar with the implicit bias training, IBT, that's offered at the Jefferson County Law Enforcement Academy? I'm not real clear on that, but maybe you could shed some light on that, and if that is a viable something that the Sheriff's Department uses.
Well, so a couple things. Number one is police officers in the state of Missouri are mandated to have both training for racial profiling and implicit bias. That's already in there. I think in the future we'll look at expanding the number of hours and stuff like that. Jefferson County, in terms of the sheriff's office, we do much more than what's required by the state, and we will continue to. So moving forward, I'm very familiar with it, and I think that moving forward we'll continue to do more. We want to set the standard for the rest of the county, and to make sure people know that we take it serious. I'll tell you a quick story, and I know we're getting close to wrapping up in time. In March, a couple of things happened. In January to March, I attended the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. And a couple of important things happened that I want to share with you. One is that I attended the National African American Museum, and I spent about 4.5 hours there going through. And there's a long documented history of how law enforcement was used to enforce some of these policies. And the reality was, when I was sitting there, a lady behind me said, well, you know, they can't deny it now. And I think that's important moving forward. I think we have to acknowledge the fact that law enforcement has had this history, and I think acknowledgement is an important piece of that moving forward. But I will tell you another thing. I was in a class called Breaking Barriers, and we were having some of these difficult conversations. And an athlete, professional athlete, Hardy Nickerson, came to our class and told his story. And in short, his story was that he worked so hard to be a professional athlete. Think about the commitment that it takes to function at that level at the NFL, and the commitment and the dedication and all the challenges that he had. And Hardy was so excited that he bought his first house in a nice area. And he invited his friend over, and the wives were talking, and him and his friend were walking through the subdivision, and everything was great. He was very excited of his accomplishments. And his first encounter in the new subdivision was a police officer, because a neighbor had saw two African-American men walking through the subdivision in a affluent area and called the police. And, you know, that resonates and kind of sticks with me, and it has ever since. And I share that story with our police commanders, because that shouldn't happen. And it shouldn't happen in Jefferson County. It shouldn't have happened to him. And I think moving forward, we have to share those stories of Hardy Nickerson and other people in our community so it doesn't happen again. And so I will share with you that my commitment is to our community to share those stories and talk about those things, to make sure our officers understand that. And then also from a supervisor standpoint, when somebody calls in to the police and they say, you know, there's suspicious subjects here, you know, why are they suspicious? You know, is it because of the color of their skin, or what are they doing specifically? And put it back on some of the people that are calling us, and to really help educate the community. I think it's our responsibility. So we're open to communication, ongoing communication, and helping our community.
Well, excellent. I'm glad you shared that story with us. And Randy, I'll turn it back to you. I know we're running short on time.
Randy, if you don't mind, I got one thing to say.
Go ahead, Al. Yeah, go ahead, Alvin, and we'll wrap it.
And then one of the things that I want to say is that as it stands right now, training will never be adequate enough. The reason I say that is because whenever you are going to a call, you got to be a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a therapist, a social worker, all of this wrapped up into one. And you don't have degrees and training and all of those different things. So it makes it very difficult for you to actually effectively do your job. I know you do it very well, but then again, you got so many hats that you have to wear. And some people aren't equipped to be a psychologist. Some people aren't equipped to be a social worker, a therapist, whatever, you know. And so unless there are some type of reforms, then your job is going to become harder and harder. And then therefore it's going to cause you to become more isolated from the community, and the community become more isolated from you. And so we've got to come together somewhere where we change things so that we can all start working in unison. So
real quick, and I know we're short on time, there's a couple of different models out there that police are using. And it's unfortunately, it's restricted to only the most well-funded agencies that incorporate mental health professionals, because it's incredibly expensive. There's a lot of talk of using more social workers, but I will tell you, once or twice a year, somebody will commit suicide in front of one of our deputies for a mental health call. And so I hear a lot of work of using more social workers. You know, what does that job description look like, and who's going to do it? I'm up for discussion on that. I will tell you, we have a mental health situation that the police are responding to. That doesn't even address the mental health component that's in our jail, which is a huge issue. But also for the officers on the street that are responding to these crises. I think there's a lot of ways that law enforcement can be enhanced, but it requires additional resources, not fewer resources. If you're talking about, you know, diverting funds away from the police, 85 to 90% of a police budget is personnel costs. So you're talking about manpower. And I don't know what that looks like. I'm open for the conversation and the discussion of, how can police be used smarter? I think we can be used, smarter, but there's also a financial component. And what's historically happened is that law enforcement has, there's this perception that, elected leaders all of a sudden know more than the police. And well, we want this. Police officers today are very educated. They're more professional than they've ever been. It doesn't mean you don't have a couple bad apples popping up, but law enforcement knows how to address a lot of the issues that are out there. It is a funding component, and it continues to be. And a lot of politicians, they push off and they go, what can I do? I can enact this piece of legislation, and that should shut everybody up, and let's move on. And I think we're past that. I think we really need to look at some of those, the true reform. How can we work smarter? And law enforcement's open for that discussion. It's just doing it the right way without risking public safety.
Yeah. Yeah, man, I have so enjoyed listening to all of you share. I especially love it when there's great respectful interaction. When things get really tense, sometimes we get more heat than light. So really there's been a lot of light here today, which I love. And Sheriff Marshak and Alvin, I love your guys' interaction there. It hit some key points, that culture and leadership, and Alvin on wearing multiple hats. It's just from the three discussions we've had, there's no question that racism is still an issue in America, and Jefferson County is part of America. So and I'll put my pastor's hat on here. I love the training and all that, but I really believe that at the heart of hearts, racism is a heart issue. So we can train, but I really do think there's a lot of change that needs to take place in people's hearts. That's where my job comes in, and and of course, Alvin, you talked about the different hats. You look at family situations in America, how fast people will argue and light the fuse. All of those are character, cultural, leadership strengths, that we need to strengthen in the hearts of people. If we could do more of that, I think it would make the job of the police a whole lot easier, And so, yeah, I definitely am committed to pray for our nation, pray for our county, pray for Sheriff Marshak and all the deputies and all the departments. I am making myself available, Dave. I'll be glad to do a spiritual heart-based devotion anytime you would like it for your officers. That's my hat, of course, And
we've had that offer. I believe we have something scheduled at Victory Church later in August.
Awesome.
Michael Sachs had contacted us,
yeah.
and so I believe we'll do something later in August. So I'm always available to chat, video chat, talk about things, and pull up some numbers and get you stats whenever you want. We get some sunshine requests asking for these stats, and want to know about some of the diversity either in our traffic stops or use of force. So we're always available to talk with our community and share anything. We're transparent.
Yeah, it's great. I love your openness. And so
Sure.
all of you, Jim, thanks for being our MC today. And both Sheriff Marshak and Alvin for joining us. Such great interaction. And of course, these will be available online. And our prayer is that it can be helpful for our community, our churches, our people to move some of these things forward in a very positive way. So thank you again. We'll wrap it up here and we'll say goodbye. And
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good seeing you.
Thanks, Alvin.
Good seeing you.
Reverend.
Good seeing you.
Thank you for joining us, and we'll wrap it up here.
All right.
Have a good day.
Thank you, Dave.
Good
See
day.
ya.
Have a good day.